Okay, so there are 6 main sections to be aware of in terms of what they all do and how they all link together in Effect House. But rather than call it a section, at the very top here, let me draw your attention to the sort of toolbar. And what's nice about this is you have a easy way to toggle your node graph area, which is called visual scripting in Effect House, and your preview, which I also will call the emulator. The preview, as the name suggests, is about previewing what the effect will look like in real time with someone using their camera. So it's emulating a smartphone. And sometimes you want to get these things out of the way, so this is just a quick way to toggle that stuff up. That's up here in this upper left area. Across the way, you have this click to update refresh that'll let you keep track of your maximum size. You got a 5 megabyte limit in Effect House as of this video, which is April 2023. And then in Effect House, unlike Metaspark Studio, you generate a QR code and you just scan it like you do any other QR code in your TikTok app to preview the effect you're building. In Metaspark, you can download a separate application, use a USB, hook your phone in directly, and pipe things in directly there. But in Effect House, you just send stuff to Effect House that is accessed by way of a QR code that's not publicly accessible. You just scan it in your app and you get your preview. Then you have your submit, and it does need to be tied to your account. So we'll talk more about this when it gets into the time to publish section, but you need to be logged into your account or your client's account, if that's possible, to submit your effect for QA. More on that later. Let's come back over here to our upper left section. This is our hierarchy, our scene view. This is the structure that shows all of the things that will actually be in your effect to be playing with or interacted with or visible on the device that the user is using. By default, you'll just have the camera and directional light. For example here, I will go ahead and just add an object. I'm right-clicking in this general area, and I'm going to go make a 2D scene object. And what you see right away is that it creates this other camera, a 2D camera instead of the 3D camera. If I select the 3D camera, you see now we've got options in this scene viewport area we'll talk about in just a second. I'll click back to this 2D camera, and we're still in that 3D view, but we have the show 2D view in the upper left of the scene viewport. And then we have this 2D scene object. So the 2D camera is sort of the holder that shows what it's going to try to render into the final output. This 2D scene object is what we've added. And then across the way with 2D scene object, I'm going to come add a component, then under 2D, an image. Okay. And now we see our preview is showing we've got a big generic image blocking everything. And I've already loaded a texture in, a hairball, a funky colored hairball, and I've added it here. So what we see is that this 2D object has these properties that are accessed on the far right side here. And importantly, maybe most importantly if you're adding images, is you've got this texture and that you add from your bin of assets that you've added. So this hierarchy is the structure of everything. And you can see right now this hairball is taking up all the space. And in 3D, moving over here into our scene viewport, we can use our right mouse, click and hold to pivot around. It's going to pivot around our main scene area. If we left click on an object that's in that 3D area, and it's a 2D object like an image, you just see it zooms right into 2D view on it. I'm going to come back out here. If you push in on your middle mouse button and go left and right, up and down, you see that instead of pivoting around the object, you're just trucking or strafing left, right, up, and down relative to your pivot point. Okay, so that's how you navigate. And then your middle mouse button, you can zoom in and out by scrolling in and out. And then up in this top section, you've got, by default, you're dealing with positional things, position of your camera, position of elements, but you've also got rotation. And you can see how the camera there now has rotational guides on it. You can click, left click, hold, and change the perspective of things that way. You've also got a scale option here, and local, and then a local and world coordinate system. In the templates I provided, we're just staying local here. In fact, you probably won't have to do anything except stay in the default view. Okay. And another way to orient yourself is to use this gizmo at the upper right. Hitting your axis, left-clicking your axis will change your view. It's a quick way to get around if you don't want to use your mouse buttons. And you can always reset your view. It'll give you back to your default. And I have messed up my views many times. This is actually very helpful. Right of this, you see your preview, your emulator, and it's preloaded with a lot of options to test how the interaction of a person in front of your smartphone might trigger something in your effect. There is also a webcam view, so you can use yourself as it. I tend to not recommend using the webcam view because I find that the webcam view, the emulator doesn't quite match the webcam and vice versa, and especially as it relates to the placement of your objects in your scene. So I typically just either test directly on my phone with my preview, or I stick with the emulator in the terms of general development. But you do have access to the webcam. You can play around with that, and that also might change a bit as this platform continues to develop. As you saw me working with earlier, on the far right, we have our inspector. This is where all the properties are that are relative to what you have selected in your scene hierarchy. So selecting my 2D scene object, you saw I have my texture, my weird hairball is connected there. It has blend modes, which can change how you might choose to display your object. Basically, you bring in your textures that you've prepared, but then even after you've brought them in, you have options of how to adjust their aesthetic later and to do it dynamically in the course of your effect. And that's all done within your inspector here. So if I want to be able to maybe make the effect change the position of this weird hairball, one thing I might do is click this next to position where it says I left click on it, I have get position or set position. Get it if I need the relative position of where that is now in space and time, and set position if I want to affect that hairball and make it do something in the X or Y axis. And if I click set position, you see in visual scripting area, which is your node graph area, you see there's now a new node that has inputs and outputs for whatever behavior we want to modify. To get rid of that, I'm just going to left click and delete it. But so that's the inspector, and you're going to see a different variety of options in the inspector depending on what your object is. You can also continue to add properties to it. I have an image property attached to the 2D object, but maybe there's something else I want to apply to it. I'm going to apply a bling post-processing effect to this. And we see it's doing something maybe a little bit unexpected, and you might have to look at what's doing that and why. But you can keep layering and stacking these properties on to these objects that you have in your hierarchy. And you see here, there's an option in the upper right-hand corner of these to reference it entirely, getting the information about it, enabling and disabling it without doing anything destructive like actually removing it as a property. And then here in the right of that, the little 3 dots, the ellipsis, you can copy it if you want to apply what you like to a different object, or reset it or remove it. I'll remove it in this case. I'm sticking with the weird hairball. So in our far lower left here, we have assets. And that assets section is where we add all of our built-in objects we might put into our hierarchy, or also import images, sequences, things like that. In this plus sign in the upper right-hand corner of assets, you see a short way to do that. Import from computer a texture sequence. Like with Metaspark Studio, you can just select a range of images as opposed to like a pre-made sprite sheet, and it will treat it all as an animation sequence. And then you could, for example, in this 2D scene object, instead of having this texture, I could add an animation sequence. And that animation sequence gives us a default animation, which I replace that default texture with what I just brought in. Okay, let's get into it. Visual scripting, aka the node graph, aka nodes. So the templates I provided do not rely on any scripting, which is a good thing because in Effect House, that is a much more limited ability. In Metaspark Studio, integrating scripts directly like JavaScript, shader code, stuff like that is much more friendly and right there for you to do. And in Effect House, they really want you to just use nodes. So I have. And to deal with this node visual scripting area, push in on the your middle mouse button, and that will let you kind of drag the canvas around. That's one way to get around. You can middle mouse scroll in and out to zoom in and out. Left clicking will let you select both nodes and the connection points between them, which sometimes can be a little tricky. But if you get that highlighted, you can delete it. Just left click and delete it. You can drag connective points, these pipes, from these green triangles to green triangles. If it's not going to work, you will see, it will tell you by giving you a red, changing the pipe red. If you drag out to nothing, it will suggest or just give you the quick menu access to add a node of your choice. If you right click, you can also click and drag the canvas. So middle mouse button in, right click, drag. And when you start to go into subgraphs, which you just saw me make, I selected a couple of things, did right click, create subgraph. Now I've got a subgraph, which means I've created its own layer that has its own stuff that I have to open up to drill into. And that becomes both difficult to troubleshoot in a visual way, but also convenient and organized in a visual way. It just depends on how many nodes you're working with. Some projects can get very large. We can expand our subgraph in the upper right hand corner here, and now we see it automatically creates this input node, goes to the timer, and I can work with stuff in here. This output node doesn't need to be used if you don't need to send something out from that subgraph. And to get back to the main graph, you just go in the upper left hand corner here, main graph, and you can click and move and position these however you like. So all these templates I've provided are just nodes. So you're going to be able to go through the graphs and subgraphs and see how data is kind of flowing through each and what the timing of things is and how you can affect them. You can search up here if things get complicated and you're just trying to find a node you know it's out there somewhere, probably hidden in a subgraph. You've also got a mini map in the upper left hand corner there, and then you see this lighter rectangle and this other gray rectangle that shows you kind of where you are in space. Very helpful when things start to get complicated. I usually just keep the minimap up. You can reset the graph view. Variables are things that you create that are your own unique values. For example, maybe in this subgraph, I want to add a variable that's just a number that says 1. And I mean that to be 1 second. So then I do get variable right here, and I connect that to my duration. So now instead of having manually entered the timer as 2, I've abstracted that out to this holder called a variable that has this value in it. And I could just adjust here to adjust the timer automatically without digging in through graphs and such. So if you could keep track of your subgraph variables and your variables, that is one organizational way you can do it. Things can work just fine without them. It just depends on what you want to kind of abstract away from entering values directly in a node. So there is an organizational concept to using these variables that can be very helpful. I'll close that window. Subgraphs. Another way to get into subgraphs, if you start really hunting around, you start to get a million subgraphs, this is a way to quickly access them or delete them. Close that. If you have a node selected and you select this icon, it will automatically create a comment around it. Comments are great for organization. In this basic layout I'm showing, I know it doesn't always seem why it would be so applicable, but as you'll see in the templates, you can start to get a sense of where the complication comes in and why variables and comments and subgraphs and all that become very helpful, because you're really spending most of your time working between your hierarchy and your visual scripting node graph area. You also have an add node plus here. It's just a convenience. You can right click anywhere in this node graph, add node, same difference. It's just about what you want. Both in Metaspark Studio and in TikTok Effect House, there's often more than one way to do the same thing. It can add to the visual confusion of the platform sometimes, but at the end of the day, it's just giving you options depending on what your workflow is going to be. So something to be aware of. You'll hear me talk about this in other videos, but Spark and TikTok are constantly changing platforms. They are not these static environments that you just have to learn and then you figured it out. They will update their software, and when you update it, it might fix some bugs and introduce others, and you just have to try to stay on top of it if you're really doing this stuff a lot and pivot accordingly. So I've certainly had to refactor whole effects because of this, and that's just sort of the world we're living in. This is not a gold record shipped product. It is a constantly evolving dynamic platform. And I really recommend just playing around with stuff and breaking it. I am a troubleshooter by nature. I did not start my profession by doing a deep academic dive. I just got thrown into things and had to figure it out. So my perspective is one of just keep a clean copy of whatever else and get a copy where you dive in with an unfamiliar environment and just start messing with stuff, and you will learn very quickly what's going to work and what's not. But you'll also hear me talk in different ways about bits and pieces of that in the templates section, also in troubleshooting and time to publish and all that. So let's take a pause here, and I'll see you in the next video.